Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for joining me for this interview. Um, in my urban fantasy series from Falstaff Books, The Blessed and Possessed, the narrative centers around issues of authority and power on a cosmological scale. But as with every fiction, there are characters with smaller wants and goals, including an organization on the antagonist side called the New World Ministries, which is a satire on Paula White, a noted evangelical minister who remains a committed supporter of former American President Donald Trump. In the story, the new word has aligned with Satan to bring about the end of days. But in reality, the theme of eschatological doom is a real and present ingredient in modern evangelical Christianity, especially here in America. If you could inform our audience, how does doom, especially in a post-pandemic America, influence and inform the modern Christian identity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it obviously goes really well with your book. As you know, because you know something about American religion yourself. There's always been a certain percentage of evangelical Protestants in the United States who have believed, at least since the mid 1800s, that the world as we know it is going to end. Right. And it was in the 1870s or so that the very modern version of the end of the world was being developed theologically by evangelicals in places like England, Scotland, Canada, and the United States.
Right.
So there's always been this group. In fact, within the 25 to 35% of religious Americans who are evangelicals, um, probably about 60% or so believe in the end of the world coming soon. I have to say one of my favorite book titles is Jesus is Coming Soon. It was written
Mm-hmm.
by William Blackstone. But the funny thing about it and why I like it is it was originally written in 1878, but it's still in print today as a book. So just to give you an idea, there's the long-standing, at least in North America, idea of this into the world. But I have to say, the last 5 to 7 years, a different kind of doom and gloom is part of the at least the older white evangelical worldview. And you can see this in terms of end time beliefs with, as I'm sure you and people who might be watching or listening to this know, QAnon beliefs and practices,
Mm-hmm.
right? So QAnon, one sees things like blood libel legends, New World Order conspiracies, even alien mythologies
Mm-hmm.
being combined with that more, at this point, 150-year-old classic conception of the evangelical end of the world. So you do see these sort of changes in, I guess, we want to call it this, the doom and gloom of contemporary American religion.
All right. So Doom is just a facet, however, in the complex matrix of beliefs within the scope of American evangelical practice. But I would pose to you a larger question. In many ways, the conservative Christian community or communities that we're speaking of are experiencing a difficult period of transition. There's a large decline in overall church attendance. Famous figures like Pat Robertson have passed, while the Falwell legacy that defined much of the post Reagan era has been tarnished. And even now, there's a growing schism and scandal taking root in the powerful Southern Baptist Convention, mirroring the widespread abuse that continues to plague the struggling Catholic Church, which is also in the midst of a sectarian split due to the liberalizing views of Pope Francis. I would also like to mention that there's a true conflict happening within the Church of Latter-day Saints, especially as it pertains to their LGBTQIA plus members. How is American evangelical Christianity, if it can be spoken to as a whole, coping with these times of great upheaval?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think in that sense of what you just said, evangelicals are no different than any other religious group, not just Christians, but religious group in the United States, with a handful of exceptions, right? In that, uh, their religious groups are losing membership in their institutions. And more Americans are identifying as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, meaning that
Mm-hmm.
they don't want to be thought of as affiliating with any religious organization or institution. In fact, right now that's kind of on average about 30% of all Americans, right? So 30% who belong to no religious group, or at least don't want us to think that they belong to a religious group. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But if you were to look back in like the 1970s, and I'll turn that off just for a sec. If you were to look back in the 1970s, you'd see that there was about 10% max of people who were nuns or not belonging to religious groups. So that's a huge growth, right? So
Right.
evangelicals then are just part of that bigger trend, right? Now we can talk more perhaps about the fact that nuns, right, are indeed often supernaturalists, meaning that they're people who believe in a god, gods, powers, ghosts, right? Supernatural beings. And some nuns, we know from the scholarship, because there's so much out there on them, some are essentially young evangelical Protestant kids, right? Like teens, 20 somethings, who like the figure of Jesus, but they don't want anything to do with what they see as an older generation's version of evangelicalism, especially young white evangelical kids who see it as bigoted, racist, hateful, and politically involved in a way. So if you look at, and I'm going to see if I can actually pop up again and not be, yep, for a second or two at least. So if you actually kind of look at younger evangelicals, they look like the rest of the United States in that they have no problem with LGBTQ people. They have no problem with the sorts of like racial integration. They believe Black Lives Matter sort of things, right? But their parents and grandparents don't, right? So even if they call themselves nuns, when we actually get to interviewing them and talking to them, we find out that they still look like evangelicals in many ways, but they don't want to affiliate with organizations they see as kind of corrupt in some ways and hateful in other ways. So you see that. But the responses are varied, I think, because evangelicals are a varied group. And so some certain groups, like some types of Pentecostals, they're not losing members at all, right? They're focused on the kind of experiential, if you will, being speaking in tongues, dancing in the Spirit, feeling the Holy Spirit, sort of things, right? They're not losing members, while others, of course, are, right? So recently, one of the groups you mentioned, the Southern Baptist Convention, who is losing members. How are they responding to this? Well, they responded to it by essentially reaffirming their patriarchal hierarchy, right, at their last meeting, saying that they're going to kick out any denomination that chooses to have women in any leadership role. And in fact, then kicked out two quite big and famous churches that were affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention. So their response, at least to all of this, was to tighten their own boundaries, right? To restrict it, make it harder to be a member, if you will. But the fact is, most groups don't seem to be doing anything at all except losing younger members. So they're not responding in essence.
So a quick follow-up, because you brought something up that I find fascinating in terms of people going towards alternate spiritualities. Of course, we know that there's been a big growth in terms of pagan or neo-paganism over the last
or
several
at least
decades.
Witchcraft, yeah.
Witchcraft. What do you think was the big initiator of this? Because when I was in college and when I was able to attend one of your classes, one of the big things kind of in the pop culture zeitgeist at the time was atheism. And it seems like atheism did not take up that space. There's there was this kind of prediction, especially like from people like Bill Maher and Sam Harris, and kind of these counterculture figures. They've turned very much into establishment figures on their own now. What do you think precipitated this massive change? Do you think that there was one event, or is this kind of a long time coming sort of scenario?
Yeah. So in terms of just focusing on something like neo-paganism, and if you think of neo-paganism as this huge circle like you would Christianity, right? Wicca, which now people practicing it prefer to just say witchcraft. That is the vast bubble within the bubble, right? There's so many more people who identify as witches than any other form of neo-paganism. It's the one that's growing immensely. It had been around in the United States since the 1950s and 1960s, so it's been slowly growing until the 1980s. Then it grew a lot more, so much so that today we have several million, meaning that we have more neo-pagans and witches than we have, say, Episcopalians, right? And other small established mainline Protestant groups like that. And then the atheist question is another thing. And first of all, I want to back off and say what's kind of fascinating here to me about atheism is that, and there have been great studies done on atheists recently, like scholarly studies, that most people who self-identify as atheists come from conservative religious backgrounds. There are some people in the United States, secular Jews, for example, who may be non-supernaturalists, right? They don't believe in gods, ghosts, any supernatural beings. I always add ghosts because that's an important aspect of supernatural belief in the United States. But at the same time, they wouldn't think of themselves necessarily as atheists, right? Because they maybe came from a reform or non-religious background themselves. There are so few people, though, who in the United States are actually non-supernaturalists, right? People who say they're atheists, sometimes you get these numbers like maybe 6% to 10% in the US. That's really high because actually when you start interviewing atheists, some do things like pray and believe in other powers, quote unquote. Right? So just not personal God. So started to do a fieldwork study of atheists in Charlotte, North Carolina, because I teach in the city of Charlotte at a university. And what fascinated me was that there were two different groups of people who would come to these kind of public meetups of atheists. And some were from the Northeast, and they were looking for friends. They were non-religious folks who were looking for friends in a new place. And the others were inevitably, the other 50% or so, were younger folks who were from very strict Christian backgrounds in rural South Carolina, North Carolina, who to not be Christian for them was to call themselves atheists, right? So it had this identity sort of thing. And if you look at some of the new atheists you were talking about from back in the early 2000s, they have those conservative backgrounds themselves.
Yes,
right? So it's very so it's interesting that people who are actually born non-supernaturalists, and there's so few of them, they usually don't have a dog in the fight, if you will, meaning that they're not committed atheists because they never had a problem with religion at the first place. They just aren't religious. You know what I mean? Oh, I'll shut that off for a second again.
Yeah, fascinating. So stepping into the realm of politics for a moment, because politics plays a huge part in religion and culture. A profound occurrence in the last decade has brought a noticeable shift into Western Christian thought, and it's actually been kind of, some people say coalesced, others would say metastasized, but he's been mentioned before. How does the entrance of former American President Donald Trump, how has his entrance affected American Christianity as a whole?
Yeah, and we did mention him a little earlier, and without a doubt, Donald Trump has changed large swaths, but I'm gonna kind of be narrowing it here when I say large swaths of white American evangelicalism.
Right.
Though perhaps, as you just said in the way you asked the question, it might be more accurate to say that his presidency and white evangelical embrace of him just enhanced certain characteristics that were already there. Right. So there is this is one thing that Kristen Kobes-Dumez, who's an evangelical herself and a historian, says in her book called Jesus and John Wayne. Came out a few years ago. And not just her, but other insiders, but also outsiders who study evangelicalism have suggested, and they have statistics to support this, right? That even the term evangelical has changed meaning for many white Americans, having less to do with believing certain theological things, and instead using it as an identity marker, right? That says something about your
Mm.
race, your politics, your tendency actually even toward conspiracy theory and wariness of science. And I think I mentioned to you before we were recording, right, that in my own teaching, even like, 12, 15 years ago, I could give a talk on evangelicalism. I could talk about 5 characteristics of modern evangelicalism and so forth and so on, give a history. I can't do that now because the most recent studies suggest that a lot of people, especially older white Americans who are calling themselves evangelicals, don't actually hold those evangelical theological tenets. Now, that is not the case, and this is important to step back. That is not the case with Black evangelicals. They have remained consistent over time. And also, as you might, know, politically very different as well, right?
Right. Absolutely. So here's a big question, and this plays into both my work and yours as well. Another aspect at play in the Blessed and Possessed is the act, ritual, and belief in possession, which is also deeply examined within the novels, often serving as a pinpoint of debate on the morality and ethics of God Almighty. You wrote a wonderful book in May of 2015 through Oxford University Press that actually helped inform my series greatly, called American Possessions, which not only explores modern concepts in our culture around the subject, but also offers a deeper analysis of how capitalism and the neoliberal paradigm impacts this complex set of ideas. Why does the culture and concepts of spiritual possession, spiritual warfare, angels, but more importantly, demons, and you also mentioned ghosts, um, offer such huge appeal to modern audiences, both spiritual and what they would say would be secular?
Yeah, that's a huge question. First, thank you for saying a kind thing about American Possessions. Um,
Absolutely. It's a
that,
really great book.
so this might be for a later conversation, but just briefly, did you know that the cover of that book actually came from? Actually, it's an ex-husband now, but the ex-husband of a person in one of my favorite metal bands.
No, who?
Her name is Trez Lance, and she is in a band called Mares of Thrace. And her husband at the time was Scott Shellhammer, who also played in metal bands. And
Yeah,
he's also a commercial artist. So he made me that cover. And the cover originally was upside down cross.
yeah,
It was an inverted cross. But Oxford University Press, a secular academic press, said we're afraid to have it upside down because people won't buy it.
right.
So they asked if they could invert the inverted cross. But that was one of those kind of cool things in my life where I got to merge like different aspects of like my life together.
That's
Music
awesome.
meets book. But anyway, that's not answering your question, is it? So I would say there are 3 things that might be going on here. I mean, there's a lot more than that, right? And
Right.
this is just terse, and this is so non-complex, but 3 things in terms of belief in demons, angels, ghosts, the importance of them today, because similar to what I mentioned earlier with the growth of people who don't belong to religious groups, you
Right.
see the growth of numbers of people who say they believe in demons, angels, ghosts. So that's actually been increasing while membership in religious groups has been decreasing,
Right.
even though demons and angels come out of different religious traditions, right? So that's changed over time. And that's also changed since the 60s and 70s. And then for demons, especially the 1980s. So because the different times these things change, there are certain things we can point to. First of all, when people are asked in polls, do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in demons? They're more likely to say that now than they are in the past, but part of that is it's more socially acceptable. And it's more
Indeed.
socially acceptable because the increase, so this is one of the things then, first, the social acceptability. Second, the increase in all sorts of mass media technologies that really promote the supernatural, right?
Mhm.
So we're talking about kind of the old style media of television, right? There are entire channels now that are nothing but supernatural TV. In fact, there are 3 or 4. If you have Roku and you stream Roku, you can see all sorts of supernatural TV 24 hours a day if you wanted to, from both the US and Canada. But also things like YouTube. What are some of the ways that you can get a lot of viewers on YouTube is to have like a ghost video, and a TikTok is the same. You can get 1 million views on the worst faked like ghost videos, right? And a lot of people, I say, they enjoy it as entertainment. Other people don't know the simple kind of like technology of how you can, for free, get video editing material. So you can have like your doors swinging, you can have all sorts of stuff going on in the background pretty easily, right? Even I could do this, and I am not technologically very proficient on media things. But that's another one, right? Is that there is just so much more conversation about this. And you do see an increase in the people saying that they believe in things like ghosts, comes at about the same time 30 years ago that it started increasing in media. Now, did they already believe this, but now it's more socially acceptable, or do they believe it now and didn't then? I don't know that answer. But then the demons also. So the group I was talking about in American Possessions is, at the time, and they've changed their different names for them, but at the time they thought of themselves as third wave evangelicals. That's what they called themselves. Third wave because they were charismatics and Pentecostals. And they saw the Pentecostal movement at the turn of the 20th century, charismatic movement in the middle of the 20th century as being waves 1 and 2. But they have a brand new wave, and they are close to the end times, so they're focusing on demons almost exclusively. I mean, they do other things obviously too, right? But it's that important. Gotta save souls because the end time's coming anytime soon. So they have developed from their mission work abroad, from folk popular beliefs in the United States from the 70s and the 80s from media, they develop a kind of theology of spiritual warfare. So demons live in our bodies, they live in places, they live in objects, and hundreds of handbooks are created starting in the 80s on how to get those things out. Hundreds of videos are made that you can watch. So this also makes, they're a small group. I mean, small by saying, at the largest, there probably were a couple million devout followers. But if you're a Pentecostal, you're likely, percentage-wise, to believe in demons, right? Evangelicals, a minority, are fascinated by demons, but that's still millions and millions of people. So this, small movement and very politicized movement, because they're very conservative, and demons are demons of feminine power, like Lilith. Demons of, I don't remember what they call it, but you could just call it a demon of liberalism that has taken over the Democratic Party, and it's dangerous. Demons of all other religions that aren't evangelicals, including non-evangelical Christian groups like Catholics. So this, whether you're a member of that group or not, because of them, you're probably more familiar with talk about demons, right? Talk about angels. And it's been increasing then belief in that. So these are three things, right? This group, the third wave spiritual warfare, mass media technologies and what's on media, not just social media, but old style television sort of media. And also the fact that, kind of a contagion, if you will, that if some people admit that they believe in ghosts, you're more likely to admit it as well. Simple social psychology. And in fact, we have around anywhere as low as 50 to 70% of all Americans at a given time saying they believe in ghosts. That's a large number.
Yeah, that is. And does that match up? I've seen a similar number, I think, to like Americans that believe in angels as well. Like, do ghosts and angels and demons kind of go hand in hand in terms of like the amount of people that believe in them, or is
ghosts is higher than the other groups, much higher than the other groups? Okay. But I think I'm just going to throw it out here. I'm pretty sure that it's a little over 50% for demons and angels at this point. But I can't say, I don't have the number in front of me like I do on ghosts, because I talk about ghosts a lot in my classes. I do want to throw out something you might find interesting, though. So Pew does polls all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they look at different regions of the United States. And the region I'm teaching in that you're from, American
Mm-hmm.
Southeast. Interestingly, the place least likely to believe in ghosts. It's still
Interesting.
high, but it's also the region most likely to believe in haunted houses.
Yeah. That somewhat makes sense to me because there is a very large literary culture down there called Southern Gothic that really focuses heavily on ghost stories and ghost cultures, especially through the American Southeast. I actually have a fellow author by the name of Tally Johnson, who's a Civil War ghost expert,
Nice.
who released a very excellent book called Creek Walking. But yeah, that's really fascinating. Let's
Can I
for a
throw
second.
one? Here's one
Yeah,
other thing that might
absolutely.
help explain it. You know, the Southern Gothic culture definitely, but also um, there might only be all Americans, about 20% of all Americans are some sort of evangelical. Over
Right.
50, slightly over 50% of all Southeastern United States people are evangelical.
Ah, okay.
If you're an evangelical, you're not allowed to believe, and people still do, but you're not supposed to believe that when your Aunt Tilly dies, she's going to come back as a ghost.
Right.
But you certainly believe that demons appear as Aunt Tilly and try to trick you. So haunted houses in the South are haunted by demons.
Fascinating. Yeah, that is a very interesting recasting of such a simple idea and just kind of redressing it for the fascinating. That's really
And
fascinating.
Pew aren't religious scholars, right? They don't study American
Yeah,
religion. So they're like, that doesn't make sense to us. Why would people believe in haunted houses but not ghosts? And it's like, well, if you come from a religion where you're not supposed to believe in ghosts, but you certainly believe in demons and they're very important in your life, that might have something to do with it, right?
that's a very fascinating adaptation. Um, so let's take a step back from the discussion about American religion for a second and get to know you. I had a clip that I will play in a later part of the video from a small Indiana band called Eleniki. Is that how you pronounce it correctly?
Yes, yeah.
But you also play guitar in the Nids, Nat Turner, Meow, and Consumption Casualties. And you know, tell me about this musician who started from rural Indiana, where, by the way, my wife is from rural Indiana. Um, she's from a small town called Michigan Town.
Wow, is it up by Michigan?
It is, I think, south of Indianapolis. I think
Okay,
it's like 45 minutes south of Indianapolis, like
gotcha.
small farm town. Um, but how does a punk rock kid from rural Indiana end up teaching American religion to the children and helping us box with God?
Yeah, I love that question because it's something that I deal with in my own research. And what I mean by that is I don't deal with myself. But I mean, if you're asking how a working poor kid who ate lots of government cheese from a small town factory farm, we had one stoplight and a flasher in our town, so probably similar to your partners in some
Right.
ways. But how I ended up being a college professor, I mean, it's a question I'm interested in, generally speaking, right? Because I'm interested in why do people believe and do what they do,
Mm-hmm.
and how do their material and social conditions enable and constrain them, right?
Right.
Because we know lots of. I'm writing a book right now about class in America,
Mm-hmm.
co-authoring it with somebody, and it's going to be more of a popular press book, right, rather than academic, trying to put it in more plain language, right? But I'm interested in that social class, right? So enabling, constraining because of our material conditions. I'm one of 5 people in my high school graduating class, and that was only of 83 who actually went to a college.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
People don't go to college where I come from, and people are poor where I come from. And that makes
Right.
sense because poor people generally don't go to college, right? We know this. In fact, only something like 36% of all Americans have a 4-year degree.
Right.
Right. That's nationally, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so, how that happened. And I guess for me, it was dumb luck in some ways, right? It really was, of coming into contact with people who themselves valued education, who told me that people like me could get loans, scholarships to go to college. Because I had no idea that I could actually go to college, right? I
Right.
was planning on trying to escape some way from my hometown from an early age, but I had no idea how. Um, so, I mean, once I got to college, I eventually found the academic study of religion. And
Yeah.
I found the academic study of religion because it's a truly multidisciplinary field, right? You can work in sociology, anthropology, history, psychology. Um, and I thought it was the best place that I could go to ask that question: why do people believe and do what they do? Right? When you're interested in focusing on something like religious questions, why do people believe and do what they do seems like a good thing to ask, even if you can't always answer those perfectly. So, in brief, I just got lucky. I got into a ton of debt, but it's proven worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too, brother. So was there any, so this is not on the list of questions I sent you, but just kind of digging into you, was there any particular moment or any particular subject that finally cinched it for you in terms of, I'm going to study religion here in America and make it my career?
Yeah, there is. So I went to Indiana University.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked Indiana University because it was the farthest away public university in Indiana from my hometown.
Right.
And I made a good choice because I really was excited about things that I got to take there. But I didn't start as a religion major, right? I started as a psychology and journalism double major. I ended up with a double major in journalism and religion. And they didn't allow triple majors. I would have had that in psychology too. But so I'm not thinking about religion, but I take a religion class and I enjoy it. But
Right.
then I take another religion class with this guy named Robert Orsi, Bob Orsi. And there's this huge, like 12,000 person international group called the American Academy of Religion. So even though it's called the American Academy, it's what people all around the world belong to. So it's international, 12,000 people. So 12 times the size of my hometown. He was the president of it one year, but this was when he had his like first teaching job, and I took a class with him. And at the time, he called it Religions of New York City. And instead of kind of reading, what would you say, kind of hearing lectures from him, right? And then reading textbooks, we were reading people's autobiographies and memoirs. He was telling us about anthropological field work he'd been doing in New York City. We read anthropologists' work, and that got me really excited. And I was sold after that, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I want to play music. Maybe I want to work in record and bookstores. But after taking that, I'm like, I'd like to do something like this for the rest of my life. And
Awesome.
yeah, and ever since then, I was very excited about it. And again, dumb luck, I managed to get into graduate programs, get an MA, get a PhD, and then unusual, but get a job.
So you exist at a very fraught intersection these days. And mentioning your job, you're a university professor that explores and critiques the neoliberal underpinnings we find in American religions in the midst of what many feels late stage capitalism. This is probably going to be one of the more theory intense questions that our audience will deal with. But as someone who has written music, sang songs, and taught curriculum that challenges the assumptions made by the status quo, what is your read on the future of greater education, especially in the religious studies? And I know that's a very fraught question because we have so many things that are going on right now, especially artificial intelligence, funding, just kind of the way people are going to school now. I'm just curious what your read on it is.
Yeah, and I love that question when you ask it. But I also was somewhat sad about it. There'll be positive things later when we're talking, but I think you're just spot on with this comment. So I can say, while I would never teach a class through any particular religious or political lens, because that's just bad teaching, right?
Right.
Frankly, that's bad teaching, right? But what we're encountering today, kind of as teachers, whether we're in elementary schools, high schools, colleges that are public, I guess more than private, right? Because they can do their own thing, is you have these people with political power, pocketbook power, who don't think that people and students in classrooms, right? So teachers should not teach historical and scientific facts, right? To students if those people with the power in the pocketbooks don't personally like those facts. I mean, literally, I couldn't be, that's true. That is just a fact, right? So whether, and kind of think about it, is whether one is happy or not with the hard science of the last 35 years that demonstrates global warming, right? Whether you like that, or whether you like the fact that, yes, poor people and minorities have been facing a much harder time in American history than those with money and power. Those are just historical and scientific facts, those two things. Sociological facts, historical facts, and climate science facts, right? Those are facts. Those aren't opinions or positions. Do you know what I mean? And it's very sad to me that those things are being made into political positions, because at the same time, you're right about the funding as well, as there's so much fewer monies. Yeah, bad English, but there's so much less money going into public education at all levels, that I know teachers who are students in grad school that I've taught, who have to buy all their equipment for their like fourth grade class. They actually have to bring the books in. They have to bring notebooks in, because it's that poorly funded. I mean, we're not taking care of students on all levels, right? And what else would I say? So frankly, and this is where I'm political in a sense, but only by being factual. Is if there are power hungry, anti-democratic politicians making moves to remove science and history from any level of education just because they don't like that science and history, then we're entering into a very different political space than a democracy with an informed citizenry. And that's scary to me, right? I mean, that's like along with climate change for me, that's one of the most concerning things I see today.
Right. Thank you for that honesty. And as you said, that is most certainly the truth. I'd like to return to the topic of the blessed and possessed in your focus of studies, but I would be remiss not to ask. And this is a much happier question. What are you listening to right now? And more importantly, and I try to really ask the people this these days, because I think the way we listen to music is very much a definition of where we are as a society. What are you listening to? But more importantly, how are you listening to it?
Yeah, that's interesting to me. And I'm hoping that you'll tell me the same about how you listen to things too in a second. I'll go first. So I listen to things in various ways, meaning that I do stream, but I also listen to CDs, and on occasion, but less so, and I guess there's some behind me you can see, I do listen to vinyl on occasion, but mostly these days, I just buy the vinyl to support small bands that I like a lot, to help them out in some way. And it's really the CDs or streaming that I would listen to more. And in terms of vinyl and CDs, it's not just that I want to support the bands, but I like the physicality of things, right? I like to have liner notes. I like to have artwork. I like to read lyrics. So of course, if you're streaming, sometimes you can get lyrics, like if you're looking on the Bandcamp site, right? But if you're on Spotify or something, there's a good chance you won't be able to get that. And also the bands don't get squat for Spotify, right? I mean, even bands that sell a lot of things generally don't get a lot of money from that. So I listen in that way. May I ask, before I go into what I'm listening to lately, how do you listen?
So, I have a show called Pondering the Orb where I not only discuss fantasy books, but I also look at two of my favorite music genres, which is melodic death metal and synthwave, which is a variety of things now. um, but I am a really big supporter of two things. Supporting artists, especially independent artists, and maintaining and respecting their copyright. So my show is demonetized and will remain demonetized because, just because of copyright issues, especially with labels. Labels are usually actually pretty nice about it, but I do a lot of listening through Spotify and YouTube, especially when it comes to synthwave, just because with digital music that is usually the place where people are able to proliferate it, and that is actually Spotify is one of the weird places where synthwave is actually able to make money.
Oh,
Like
that's nice.
synthwave composers are actually able to do that, but there's a lot of weird economic tricks that go into that. um I really try to listen and buy from Bandcamp,
Yeah,
where
me too.
I buy and purchase all the music that shows up on my show on Bandcamp, and most of the music that I listen to that really catches me. I mean, the one good thing for me about streaming is that I'm able to listen to a lot of music at once from a lot of different places. So if something catches me, I usually go and purchase it. I usually go and buy it. I'm a big t-shirt guy, so I really try to
Too.
buy band merch because I think that's really important now, especially post pandemic. I want to get into collecting vinyl, but just like collecting books, I only have so much room in my life, and now I have a little one, so he has so much room out of my life. Uh, but for the most part, I do a lot of streaming and I do a lot of purchasing of music through Bandcamp
Yeah,
mostly.
yeah.
I really try now, especially with the way the music industry is structured, to listen to more independent bands, because the nice thing now, especially like if you look at the heavy metal scene, there are so many labels in heavy metal that will never be big labels. And you and I both know this because you've been playing music for a long time too, and you know what that scene kind of looks like. There's never going to be a big label again, but there's really smart labels out there that understand that, like, hey, these bands have only so much licensing power and they have only so much pull, and
Hmm.
they need to get out there and tour and sell their merch. So a lot of labels, especially the smaller ones in heavy metal now, are very open to working with YouTubers and digital content collators like me. So it's an interesting thing because you want to support indie, but at the same time you want those bands to go forward and get bigger. And if they can get a good deal at the big labels, which is very rare now,
Hmm.
um you want to be able to support them. But at the same time, like, it's the same thing that I'm dealing with right now in publishing, especially when it comes to fantasy. um
Hmm.
Traditional publishing, especially here in New York where I live, is, pardon my language, fucking falling apart. um and independent publishing is on the way up, but there's so many cultural taboos in independent publishing. Like, you can't support traditional publishers. If you're It's kind of like, if you're an indie artist, you shouldn't be supporting the big label artists, but we know that that's not how
Yeah.
that really works. So it's a very interesting place to work in now, especially with the YouTube show. I find actually labels these days, especially younger labels, are so awesome, especially like hard rock and heavy metal labels. They really get it, and they really understand, like, it's the interaction with the fans that matter more than trying to necessarily get on rock radio or anything like that. But I have to ask, what are you listening to these days?
Yeah, yeah. So I have to say I listen to every genre of music for the most part, right? But lately, and I think I might have mentioned this in like an email or something,
Mm-hmm.
um, things I keep playing over and over lately are Big Braves album that came out in February called Nature Mort. So
Yeah.
Dead Nature or Still Life is another way. And I absolutely love that. I met them last August and they were just the kindest people
Yeah.
that make the heaviest, most intelligent, and probably the best like feminist metal record I have ever heard in my life. And when I say metal, I mean, you and I know this, but oftentimes people we're speaking to may not, is when you say metal, you literally can mean dozens and dozens of different things, right? Things
Right.
that you might not hear even as metal, right? So this band is like drone stuff that also will use a cello, but also has like Appalachian sorts of singing,
Right.
but it's still like the loudest, heaviest thing you can imagine, right? So that's one thing I've been listening to over and over. Faytooth's Remnants of the Vessel album that came out, I think, in November.
Yeah.
Sadly, though, you did this, but did you hear that their second guitarist just left?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, so
I,
like a week or two ago, they decided to part ways with her. So they're going to have a very different sound because they're just going to go as a three-piece now. And of course, in the
yeah.
studio, that's not going to make a difference. But I think live, that's going to have to make a big difference, right? Um, and then Funerals album that came out also in February, Let the Earth Be Silent, is probably again one of the best kind of funeral doom albums I've ever heard in my life. I mean, I like stuff like Pallbearer, but this just moved me so much more because they
It's
always
such a
have
good
this sort
album.
of low goth, slow doom sort of thing going, right?
Yeah.
And then something that I don't think a lot of people know, but I just love, is a woman from the Netherlands who calls herself Mouth Wound, and she put out her first full length called Nothing Will Belong to Us, I think in April or so, and I can't get enough of that. I really like the other albums. I can't get enough of it. If you know Pharmakon, the industrial musician from New York, she sounds like Pharmakon. Trine Poshberg sounds like the woman who was Pharmakon. So which kind of harkens back to this like late 80s non-disco beat version of industrial music like SPK, for example, and
Right.
Einstürzende Neubauten, Current 93. So they have that sound. And I just, I think it's beautiful. I know a lot of people find it horrific sounding and scary, but to me, it's just gorgeous and beautiful. There are others though. So I've been listening a lot to Callie Malone's last two records. She's a drone composer, and her last album was done with she puts organ music, organ pipes, right, through synthesizers, and then plays in her last album with her fiance, who's the lead performer in Sun, the band.
Yes.
And then also with a friend of hers who does a lot of movie soundtracks playing cello. So it's those three pieces playing 3 hours of drone on three different versions of the same piece that are about an hour long. I've been listening to Sarah Davachi's also similar sort of interesting drone compositions. Um, South Korean hardcore band named Slant.
Yeah.
Oh, you know them, excellent, because
Yeah.
they are so good, right? They harken back for me to like Bad Brains sort of speed and tightness, going
Right.
all the way back to those 80s hardcore bands. But also Alice Coltrane.
Yeah.
I've been listening to her lately. Olafur Arnalds, Emma Ruth Rundle. I should stop there because I could keep going on. But those are the like 6 to 10 bands that I've been listening to most lately.
That's awesome. I'll definitely check out Mouth Wound because I really like experimental progressive music, especially stuff in the drone and noise genre. You mentioned funerals, and I have to stop and mention for a second. Um, Funerals really has taken their sound and done something very fascinating with it. In metal, there's making an album, there's creating an aesthetic, and Funerals has their own aesthetic that kind of reclaims the fun parts of like black metal and
Mm,
really recasts it into like a more gothic tone
yeah.
that's very palatable. I have to say I really like Funerals. But getting back to the questions, thank you
And
so
just to
much.
jump in again, though, too,
Yeah.
is I totally agree with you, and I love their previous album that came out like 6 years ago. But this new album is so much better, even though I love the previous one. It's just so of all of one piece, and in fact, all
Yes.
of the like that kind of first four things that I mentioned, Fay Tooth, Big Brave, Funerals, and Mouth Wound, they're all, because we all have access to Spotify now, you can find like a song that's great. But
Yes.
then there aren't, but not necessarily whole albums. And all of those I mentioned, I love them from start to finish, right? It's like I don't want to pick and choose. It's like, oh, well, I love these two songs, but I'll not the rest. It's like they're all one perfect piece and made to be listened to from the front to the end.
For the sake of irony and humor in this episode, amen. Yes, I absolutely no. I love if I'm going to buy an album, I want a whole album that's just great compositions, no fillers. Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to our questions.
Yes.
bridging the topics of late stage capitalism and evangelical Christianity, the internet and social media realms, which we've already mentioned previously, have crystallized attention to the phenomena and prominence of prosperity gospel traditions, which are usually centered around celebrity-like personalities at the head of these churches and organizations, which feature massive congregations and are often deemed popularly as megachurches. Needless to say, the reaction to them is divisive. How would you characterize the nature of prosperity churches in the 21st century from their previous iterations, which have been present throughout American history since the beginning of the country's existence?
Yeah, and you certainly have that right, and especially starting in right after the Civil War, you get the modern, literally calling itself prosperity gospel, right? So you can see things before then, but literally even Russell Conwell calling his Acres of Diamonds sermon a prosperity gospel, right? So that's been around. The idea that God wants everybody to be rich, right? And there's this kind of double cross on it, because if you're not rich, that means you're not right with God, right? So, but in the contemporary period, you see this merging of prosperity gospel with the power of positive thinking and the law of attraction. And the law of attraction's main ritual practice of manifestation. Right, so these things are merging, and I would say if you're wanting to look at one figure who uses that language, both of law of attraction and prosperity gospel, Joel Osteen is a perfect example of this, right? In fact, he has language, because I've recently been teaching and writing about this prosperity gospel in contemporary versions that use the law of attraction. He literally uses and merges these things, right? So this idea that thinking positively and asking a divine power for blessing, in other words, not acting, but thinking, can make one healthy and wealthy. That seems to go to me really well with this kind of new form of new liberal, neoliberal capitalism, right? That almost it dematerializes the world. It dehistoricizes the world. It desocializes the world, meaning that it's this idea that you are this free agent, and no matter what happened to you in the past, no matter what position you were born into, you, by the power of your own mind, can make yourself healthy, wealthy, right? And powerful. And if you don't, it's somehow your own moral fault, right? So, it goes that kind of blessing the rich, blaming the poor sort of thing, right? So you just, and there are these kind of sad stories that are in scholarship about this. So Milton Harrison, a couple of years ago, wrote a book called Righteous Riches. And it was about a form of the prosperity gospel and interviewing people in one particular church. And he like points kind of an obvious thing out to them. Like most people who are into the prosperity gospel, they're not wealthy folks. Right. So when he points out to the people he's interviewing, he's like, you haven't gotten rich, but yet your theology says that God makes everybody who's good with him rich. They're like, well, it's my moral fault. I'm not thinking hard enough. I'm not praying hard enough. I'm not spiritual enough. So they keep blaming it rather than saying, well, you know what? I started, at this rung of the socioeconomic ladder. And it's going to be harder for me to become incredibly wealthy, like Elon Musk or Donald Trump. because they started much higher on those social ladders than I ever did. But instead, they spiritualize it, right? That it's a spiritual failing, a moral failing. So it's, I'm fascinated by it and how it kind of merges with the neoliberal idea that somebody is a free agent completely subtracted from anything that happened to them in the past.
Right. So this goes perfect with our next question. I've mentioned Donald Trump, who almost in a way has his own sense of political prosperity gospel that he's pushing to people in terms of make America great again. We're going to restore our place in the world. But let's talk about another disconcerting individual in the room, Jesus Christ. The savior of the Christian faith appears in as a fully realized character in my series, or at least my take of him does in The Blessed and Possessed. But in actuality, he presents a fascinating figure in the American consciousness, both in and out of the church. Fitting with the previous question about prosperity gospels, how do American conservatives essentially take a person dedicated to serving the poor and marginalized and recast him and his message in the form of a pro-capitalistic God King, and find such success in doing so?
Yeah, and this is where I like the question, because as someone who studies religion from an academic viewpoint, I get to kind of put on my cap of professor of religion. And one thing that seems to be most consistent among Americans, and I'm sure people who aren't Americans as well, but I study contemporary United States, is that they tend, right, to project their own likes, their own dislikes, their biases, their desires, their assumptions about the world into their God, right? My
Yeah.
God believes what I personally believe. And regardless of what sacred text might say, sometimes it might agree with him, sometimes it might not. I'm going to ignore the parts that don't agree with me. And I would say that you can even say that, this isn't particular to one political party or orientation or cultural orientation. We all do this sort of thing, right? And one
Absolutely.
thing we all need to work on, right? And hopefully we can work on this, is to fight that social psychology, to fight that notion that just because I personally like something, that must be what my supernatural being promotes, right? I'm afraid, some things that we don't see people doing a lot is we don't see people like questioning whether that actually is the case, right? And again, we can talk about any religious group or any religious belief and practice in this. So it's not just conservatives probably who are guilty of this. It's probably all of us. So, and I think, making these huge generalizations is what I'm going to do here. But I think that most people, perhaps unconsciously, like to make the world in their own image. But again, I think it is often on an unconscious level, right? I think that most people, even if they have the worst, most disgusting beliefs in the world, think about white supremacist Christians. Awful, awful. I can never study them because I can't be not biased against them. Usually I find it easy to study all the religious groups, but I can't. I would never do a fieldwork study, for example, of white supremacist Christians. But they probably earnestly believe it, right? They're not saying, I'm going to pretend I believe that my God says this because I can make money somewhere. They really believe that. It's that kind of unconscious social psychology that's playing out there.
Fascinating. So this gets into the next question, because social psychology also fits into how individuals define their own personal psychology. And the main character of my series is a reincarnated St. Patrick of Ireland who goes through an intense journey to not only save the world, but to confront the contradictions in his Catholic faith. He does not lose his belief in Christ, but does go through a process of breaking from the idea of churches as a needed structure to properly live in accordance with the Gospels. In terms of today's discussion and the community surrounding it, the term deconversion has arisen to encapsulate the idea you can have Christ without a church, which has had great appeal to those on the liberal and left-leaning political spectrum, as well as marginalized communities, including the LGBTQIA plus community. How should we look at this? And you touched on this, I think, well in a previous question as well. How should we look at this deconversion in the context of American religious history? And what do you think this means for how the modern world conceives cultural figures like Christ?
Yeah, so first I gotta say kudos, first of all, for having it be Saint Patrick, since that's my middle name. You probably didn't know that, but it's funny because I got the name Sean Patrick McCloud, and yet I have no like Irish background whatsoever. But I got a cool name in that respect. But also for having kudos for having him really look like a modern American in some ways. By which I mean, there are so many people who culturally like a lot about Catholicism, but don't want anything to do with the institution again, right? I mean, so some of these nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, are also ex-Catholics, right? Or people who still think of themselves in some ways as Catholic, but they don't want to be affiliated with an institution they again see as, frankly, full of things like pedophiles, right? And all things like this. Although statistically, you wouldn't be surprised, Jay, but as you know, there are plenty of American religious groups, sadly, that have a lot of sexual abuse cases. And you mentioned, I think earlier, the Southern Baptist Convention as being one of those.
Right.
So it's not just Roman Catholic churches. But I think it's, you're making this character into somebody that looks very much like an American in general, right? And I think of how,
if I may break in for a second, he's also a reflection, I think, of kind of my research into the modern Irish identity. One thing that happened with the church abuse scandal in the Catholic Church is that there was a real divide in Ireland where a lot of Irish essentially decided they weren't going to be Catholic anymore. They were still going to be Christians. And this is what caused a sweeping majority to vote in things like abortion and gay marriage inside of Ireland. So Patrick's also there to kind of like reflect how the Irish kind of have changed their thinking too on the Vatican and Rome itself. But I'm sorry, please go on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that is perfect, because that's kind of what I was going to say next about the U.S. case, right? Is that even as early as the mid-70s, right, into the 80s, the vast majority of American Roman Catholics are for women in the priesthood and for the choice of having abortion or not on your own. Right? So they belong to an institution that they strongly disagree with in many ways, but they still find something in the culture of the institution. Sometimes we call it the smells and bells, right? The aesthetic of things, the history and family background of things. But when it comes to actually the politics of it, it might sicken them, right? And then now we have people who are actually leaving because of these things. But yeah, I think you're right too, that similar to the last question, again, we all want to kind of make the supernatural in our own image in some ways, right? So one response is to leave a church that's outrageously sexist, that damns LGBTQ people to hell. Another response is to imagine a very different religious group that might have some similarities, but doesn't damn LGBTQ people to hell, right? So, similar to the first question, seeing it in your own image. And we do have people doing that. We also have people just dropping out, you might say, right? That's why we have 3 out of 10 Americans who want to call themselves nuns or don't want to be affiliated with specific groups because they're so troubled by what they see in the larger organizations.
Right. I had a question about movies and television, but we discussed earlier that you may not have. But I do have
something I can say about that, though.
I will ask that question, but I kind of have a follow-up question off of what you just said. One thing that happens in my novels is that Patrick actually is in communication with Pope Francis. It's actually, he's called the chair. I never directly call him Pope Francis, but he's called the chair on the cell phone that he calls Patrick from. Do you think that the liberalizing views of not Saint
Not
Francis,
yet.
Pope Francis. Well, that gets into another question because there's a real split in the Catholic community right
Yeah.
now in terms of how they view. Do you think that he is able to forestall the, I guess, disintegration of at least his organization and his community? Because it really does seem like Catholics are really fleeing the organization itself. Do you think that's too little too late for him, even with his liberalizing views? And there's been discussion of allowing priests to marry. He is trying to very much liberalize the Catholic viewpoint on the LGBTQ community. Do you think that he has, like, is there a foreseeable end game where the Catholic Church survives the trouble that it goes through the changes that he's trying to make, or do you think it's too little too late? And that might be a more personal observation for you than it.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm definitely not somebody who can predict the future, but it seems to me that one individual or even a cadre of individuals can't do a whole lot to change the social and historical forces that are worldwide, that not just Catholics, but all sorts of religious organizations are facing, right? So
Yeah.
you can have, I mean, look at mainline Protestants who are, in some cases, extremely, um, liberal on all sorts of cultural and political views. They're dropping like flies too in terms of numbers, right?
Right.
So there's other things that are happening that probably won't make a difference. And here's one interesting thing I think about Francis, that a lot of people don't maybe think about as much, is everything you said about him is true, except he is the Pope who has ramped up the exorcist squads.
Yes.
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 Which is fascinating to me, right? So, modernizing in all sorts of ways, but medievalizing in at least that way.
Right.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
find that fascinating.
It really is, and that is a conversation for a completely different interview. But though this interview is to help promote an urban fantasy series about Judeo-Christian cosmology, I want to ask you both as a professor and maybe as a fan, and maybe you have separate answers for those two different identities. But what do you think, or who do you think is doing something right with this kind of material and subject matter? Do you have any shows, movies, music, documentaries that you would suggest to our audience if they want to further dive into the topic of American religions and in particular American Christianity?
Yeah, so I thought so long and hard about this, and I kept drawing a blank as like a fan, but as a professor, um, what I find interesting to do is to watch reality shows, whether it's ghost hunting reality television or other sorts of reality television, or things like Netflix Prime documentaries on so-called cults, which means a religion we personally don't like, right? I mean, but not to watch them to learn, but rather to watch them as kind of an ethnography of media, if you will, to try to find out what makes people like find these things popular, right? What is it about ghost hunting reality TV that people seem to latch on to? What assumptions do they make about the world? What assumptions does that like People series that you can find on Netflix or somewhere on cults, what are they making about what is a good religion, what is a bad religion, how is it framed? So I would say in some ways being a professor makes it impossible for me to enjoy like a good religious drama. Like, do you remember what was the one called? I can't even think of it. About a group on an island called Black Sunday or something like this. It was a series
Oh,
on Netflix a few years ago. And I'm like, I can't watch it now because I'm trying to analyze everything sociologically, right? So it kind of kills that aspect. But in terms of actually kind of, if you can step back from your own likes and dislikes, from your own assumptions about the world, and kind of sit and like, if I'm going to watch a ghost reality show, what assumptions are they making about the supernatural world? What
right.
are they saying? How do they draw boundaries about what's authentic and inauthentic? But you can ask that exact same question about and there's so many out there right now, all these different documentary series about so-called cults and new religious movements, right? What assumptions are they making? What do they see as egregious and not as egregious, right? And if if it's like sexual abuse, why is it about this tiny group of 30 people versus the Southern Baptist Convention, right?
Right.
Why do we pick on certain groups and not others? So it's not saying that those groups are good or bad, but rather how are they being represented and portrayed, and
In
who's missing in these stories.
in some ways, who's allowed it, what religion it can be discussed within the so-called Overton window in a way.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have one final question for you, and it deals with one critical question in the series, and a question that concerns many parts of Christianity in the modern world, and it revolves around the maintenance to the notion of God's perfection and a perfect world that mirrors what they believe their deity is seeking to manifest. I'm curious what this perfection means to conservative Christian evangelicals, especially after they recently achieved several points of political purpose, including striking down a person's right to medical privacy in terms of abortion and gender affirming care, social and economic victories through the United States Supreme Court against poor and marginalized communities. And speaking geopolitically, one of their greatest concerns in Israel, another focus of eschatological fixation, is arguably far safer and more secure than ever since its establishment in 1948. Meanwhile, they continue to rake in cash despite the scandals and the demographic challenges I mentioned previously. For conservative evangelicals today, and in the light of the current climate, what does the idea of God's perfection mean to them? And what does it look like in the mid 2020s versus how it may have been conceived in the past?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a big question, and you can't answer it for everybody, right? But
Right.
if you think about the politically active folks that you're talking about, um, they're looking for particular forms of theocracy. And there are lots of studies of this now, right? I mean, you have the, forgive the pronunciation, Rushton Mulrooney is back. He's somebody who believed in a religious government way back in the 70s and 80s when he was writing. Um, and it was catching on with small groups of people, right? Like Jerry Falwell, the moral majority. But then, the kind of contemporary Christian right, the people who literally are writing books about Donald Trump and prophecy, are talking about essentially making a white Christian nationalist state, right, that does away with democracy. And does away with the civil rights of people who are not certain types of Christians. That's scary, right? I mean, there are really people out there that are making this argument, and some of them are in the House of Representatives, right? They're not the majority, right? But they're in our government. And way back when, right? We know that the first three evangelical presidents were Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and then the second George Bush. And the second George Bush was a spiritual warfare believer.
Yes, he was.
But at the same time, he did not believe in a theocracy, right? We might not have liked him lying about going to war and various things, but he wasn't a theocrat. Interestingly, Donald Trump is by no means an evangelical of any sort.
Yeah.
In fact, in the Trump books of prophecy, it's because he's sinful that they want to follow him because he was sent by Jesus. I don't know if you've read any of the Trump prophecy stuff.
I unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, but so somebody who religiously likes Robert Schuller's prosperity gospel that and power positive thinking. That's the only bit of religion he ever had because his dad had that. He's the one that is happy with theocracy, right? Because of the power he gets from those who will vote for him and follow him for that. And and I'm sorry to say it, but we just have to be honest. It's a white nationalist Christian theocracy. It's not open to all forms of Christianity by any means.
Right. So
their perfection is the lack of perfection for so many other people, right?
all right. So I think we will leave that there for now. Sean, thank you again for joining me for this wonderful discussion about my work, your work, and this incredibly nuanced, fascinating topic. Where can we find you, and what are you working on right now?
Well, you can't find me anywhere except teaching because I don't have any social media, and I kind of like it that way.
Bless you.
But
Bless you.
yeah, I mean,
You are free. Sir, you are free. You are free. You are
I
free.
had some about 7 years ago, and then I got rid of it all because I thought it was taking up a lot of time, and it changes the way our neurons like bounce around in there, doesn't it?
Did you have to
It's
get an
bad enough that
exorcist
I
to
have
do it?
like a phone, but huh?
Did you have to get an exorcist to do it? Because sometimes
It was a little odd. It was like I'm sure I know it's much harder to be addicted to something, but it was like an addiction, right?
yeah,
Once you don't have it, you're like, I wonder what's happening. I wonder what's happening.
right.
Shouldn't I be able to check this social media? But what I'm doing is right now I'm writing a book with a sociologist of education named Allison Hurst, and we're co-writing a popular press book on social class in America. And we're going to have 12 chapters: social class and taste, social class and the intertwinings with other variables like race and gender, place, age. Um, and there will be a chapter on social class and religion, of course. so, so yeah, doing that right now and looking really forward to getting that done by next summer and turning it into the publisher.
Excellent. Sean, thank you so much for joining me. This has been such a great opportunity to talk with you, and just some of the insights you've given have been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for kindly having me come on and talk to you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.